Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. When I think back to that afternoon, I still get a strange feeling in my chest, like a mixture of warmth and disbelief. It started out as an ordinary day, quiet and slow, the kind where you don't expect anything to happen. But then my friend's brother showed up at my door. I hadn't seen him in years, maybe since the last family gathering my friend invited me to. Back then, he was just her older brother, polite but distant, always standing on the edge of conversations. So when I opened the door and saw him standing there, holding a box in his hands and a nervous look on his face, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He said my name softly, like he wasn't sure I'd remember him. His voice carried something unfamiliar, hesitation mixed with urgency. I stepped aside and let him in, even though I had no idea why he had come. The box he was carrying looked worn, taped along the edges, like it had been sitting in a closet for years. When he set it down on my dining table, he exhaled in relief, as if he had been holding his breath the whole way here. I asked him if everything was all right, and he gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He told me he needed help. Not in a dramatic way, not as though the world was crashing down, but in a quiet, personal way that caught me off guard. He explained that inside the box were letters and old photographs, things from his childhood and his parents. His sister, my friend, had kept some of these items stored in my garage years ago, and he had only just remembered. But it wasn't just about collecting old memories. He wanted me to help him go through them. He said he couldn't face it alone. I remember pulling out one of the photographs, a faded picture of him as a boy, standing in front of a fishing boat with his father. His face lit up with recognition, but there was a heaviness in his expression too. He explained how much he missed those days, how different life felt now that so many years had passed. I listened, unsure of what to say, but something about the way he spoke drew me in. He wasn't just reminiscing, he was reaching for something deeper, a connection to a part of himself that seemed lost. As we spread the letters and photographs across the table, the room began to feel different. It wasn't just my dining room anymore, it felt like a place where time had folded in on itself, bringing the past into the present. He read some of the letters aloud, his voice trembling slightly. One was from his mother, written in looping handwriting, reminding him to be patient with himself. He laughed softly, saying she always knew what he needed to hear. And for a moment, I saw not just the man standing in front of me, but the boy in the photograph, vulnerable and searching. I could feel the tension between us shift. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was noticeable. I hadn't expected to share such an intimate window into his life, and yet here we were, side by side, piecing together fragments of his story. He glanced at me more than once, as though he was checking if I was really listening, if I understood. And I did. More than I realized. Outside, the sun began to set, sending streaks of orange and gold through the window, casting long shadows across the table. The light fell over his face, softening the lines of age and worry. He looked tired, but grateful. He told me he hadn't spoken like this to anyone in years, not even his sister. He said he trusted me because I was always the kind of person who didn't rush to judge. Hearing that made my heart catch, because I hadn't known he thought of me that way. At one point, I reached for one of the letters at the same time he did. Our hands brushed, and though it was nothing more than a small touch, it carried weight. He paused, looked at me, and for a second I thought he might say something he couldn't take back. But he only smiled and let me take the letter first. It was such a simple moment, yet it lingered in the air between us. We kept talking until the room grew dim, and I finally had to turn on the lamp. He leaned back in his chair and told me he hadn't expected this visit to feel so different, so meaningful. He admitted he thought it would just be a quick stop, pick up the box, and leave. But instead, it had turned into something else entirely, a conversation that felt like opening a door neither of us had realized was there. By the time he stood to leave, the box was no longer just a box of old papers and pictures. It had become something alive again, carrying stories that had found their way back into the present. He looked at me with gratitude, but also something else, something I couldn't quite name. As he thanked me, I felt a warmth rise inside me. I had simply offered my time and a listening ear, yet it had turned into an experience that neither of us expected. When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a long while, listening to the silence of my house. The table was still scattered with a few photographs he had chosen to leave with me. I traced the edges of one with my finger, realizing that day had shifted something in me too. I hadn't just helped him revisit his past, I had rediscovered something in myself as well. And as I sat there, staring at the soft glow of the lamp and the shadows it cast, I knew this was only the beginning of a story I would carry with me for years to come. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of his visit. My house still carried the faint echo of his voice, as though his words had settled into the walls. I kept glancing at the photographs he had left behind, almost expecting him to come back and ask for them. But he didn't. Instead, late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message. It was him, thanking me again, and asking if I'd be willing to help him sort through the rest of the box. I stared at the message for a while before replying. Something inside me hesitated, not because I didn't want to see him again, but because I wasn't sure why his presence stirred such an unexpected reaction in me. I told myself it was just nostalgia, that he represented a part of life I hadn't thought about in years. Still, I typed back a simple of course, and set the phone down with a sigh. When he arrived the next evening, he looked lighter somehow, as if the weight of the past had shifted, but not disappeared. He carried another stack of things this time, a notebook, a small wooden box, and a folded sweater that must have belonged to his father. He placed them carefully on the table, almost ceremoniously, as though handling fragile glass. We began again, sifting through the pieces of his past. The wooden box held coins his father had collected, each one with its own history. He told me about the times his father would hand him one of those coins after a long day, saying, "This is for patience, son." His eyes softened as he spoke, and I could tell those small objects held more weight than anyone else might realize. There was a quiet intimacy in the way he let me into his memories. He didn't rush. He took his time, unfolding each story with care, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn into the rhythm of his voice. At one point, he looked up and asked, "Do you ever feel like parts of your life are locked away in boxes like this, waiting for someone else to open them with you?" The question startled me. I wasn't expecting to be asked something so personal. But the truth was, I did. I told him how I had old journals tucked away in my closet, pages filled with thoughts I hadn't revisited in years. I admitted I wasn't sure if I ever would, because sometimes the past feels heavier than the present. He nodded as though he understood completely, and in that moment, I felt a connection I hadn't felt in a very long time, two people acknowledging the weight of time together. The sweater lay folded between us on the table, untouched until he finally lifted it and pressed it to his face. I looked away out of respect, giving him space, but when I glanced back, his eyes were damp. He laughed softly, embarrassed, and said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to, it still smells like him." I reached across the table, resting my hand lightly on his arm. It wasn't planned. It was instinct. And though he didn't speak, the gratitude in his eyes said more than words could. As the night went on, we shifted from memories to small stories, then to laughter. He told me things about his teenage years I'd never known, mischief he and his friends got into, the trouble he hid from his sister. I shared a few of my own memories, ones I hadn't thought to tell anyone in years. Somewhere in between, the heaviness gave way to something lighter, something almost playful. At one point, the power flickered and the room dipped into darkness before the lights returned. He joked that maybe the past didn't want us meddling with it too much. But when the lights came back, the shadows felt different. Softer. Closer. By the time we decided to pack things away for the night, it was late. He lingered at the door, holding the wooden box under his arm. He thanked me again, but this time his voice carried more certainty, as though he had found something here, something he wasn't ready to let go of. Before leaving, he paused and said, "I don't know why, but talking to you feels like I'm talking to someone who actually sees me." That sentence stayed with me long after the door closed. I stood there, the quiet of my house pressing in, realizing that his visits were no longer just about sorting through memories. They had become about something else entirely, something unexpected, something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but couldn't deny I wanted to explore. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over. And for the first time in a long while, I wondered what tomorrow might bring if he knocked on my door again. The next time he came, I knew something had shifted. It wasn't just about the photographs or the letters anymore. There was a quiet familiarity between us, as if those 2 evenings had built a bridge we hadn't even realized we were crossing. When I opened the door, his smile was different, softer, more certain, almost like he had been waiting for this moment all day. He carried no box this time. Just himself. And that alone told me everything. I stepped aside, and as he entered, I felt the air thicken with unspoken understanding. We settled into the living room instead of the dining table, choosing comfort over order. I made tea, and while the kettle hissed on the stove, he wandered around the room, studying the photographs on my walls. He stopped at one picture of me from years ago, standing near a lake. "You look at peace there," he said quietly, almost to himself. I joined him with 2 mugs, and we sat close enough that our arms brushed occasionally. At first, we spoke about ordinary things, work, the weather, the little frustrations of daily life. But gradually, the conversation deepened. He told me he often felt invisible, even within his own family. He said people expected him to be strong, dependable, never shaken, but inside he carried doubts that no one seemed to notice. I listened, really listened, and when he paused, I told him I understood. I knew what it was like to feel unseen, to carry your own stories quietly while the world assumed you were fine. His shoulders relaxed as though a weight had been lifted. There was something freeing in being able to admit those things, not just for him, but for me too. I shared parts of myself I usually kept hidden, the times I had doubted my choices, the nights I had wondered if life had already passed its brightest point. He looked at me with such attentiveness that I felt both exposed and comforted at once. The rain began to tap against the windows, steady and soft, as if the world outside had decided to hush itself so we could keep talking. The room felt wrapped in that sound, cocooning us. I noticed how his hand rested near mine on the couch cushion, not quite touching but close enough to make me aware of the space between us. Every small gesture felt magnified, every glance heavier than words. At one point, he leaned back, sighed, and said, "I thought I came here to ask for help with old memories. But maybe what I really needed was to create new ones." His words struck something deep in me. I hadn't realized until then how much I, too, longed for something new, something real, something honest. We sat in that moment for what felt like forever, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, as though the air itself is speaking. Then, with a quiet courage, I reached across the space and laid my hand gently on his. He didn't move away. Instead, he turned his palm up to meet mine, his fingers curling around in a way that felt both steady and fragile. It was such a simple act, yet it carried the weight of trust, of mutual respect, of something blooming between us we hadn't named yet. We stayed like that, hand in hand, as the rain continued. He began telling me stories not from the past, but from his present, his hopes, his small victories, his fears about the future. And I shared mine too. It wasn't dramatic or grand. It was quiet, real, and deeply human. When he finally rose to leave, he hesitated at the door longer than before. His eyes held mine, and I could see unspoken words flickering behind them. But instead of saying them, he gave me a smile, gentle, grateful, promising. And in that look, I knew we had crossed into new ground. After he left, I lingered in the quiet, my heart still beating with the rhythm of our conversation. I walked to the window and watched the rain drip down the glass, thinking about how strange and beautiful it was that something so unexpected had found its way into my life. I had opened my door to help with a box of memories, and instead, I had discovered a connection I hadn't dared to imagine. And that night, as I lay awake listening to the soft echo of the rain, I realized I no longer feared the silence of my house. Because now, it felt like it was holding something new, an unfolding story, alive and waiting. The days that followed were different. I found myself waiting for the sound of his knock, for the familiar rhythm of his presence filling my quiet rooms. But this time, it wasn't about boxes or photographs, it was about what had quietly grown between us, something neither of us had expected, yet neither of us could ignore. When he returned, there was no hesitation. He stepped inside as though he belonged, and I welcomed him without question. We sat together at the dining table, but the photographs and letters remained untouched in their box, resting in the corner. It wasn't the past calling us anymore, it was the present. He spoke about his sister, my friend, and how he wasn't sure she'd understand if she knew we had been spending so much time together. There was no shame in his voice, just a quiet acknowledgement of how delicate life's connections can be. I told him I understood. I had thought about it too. But then I reminded him that what we were building wasn't about anyone else, it was about the two of us, sitting here, sharing something real. We decided to go for a walk. The air was cool, the sky just beginning to turn the deep colors of evening. Leaves crunched under our feet, and the smell of damp earth rose around us. As we walked side by side, he told me about dreams he hadn't shared with anyone in years, traveling, writing, maybe even starting fresh somewhere new. I listened, not with the intent to offer solutions, but simply to hold space for his hopes. In return, I spoke of my own dreams, the small things I still wanted for myself, the ways I longed to feel alive again. At one point, he stopped, turned toward me, and said, "I didn't expect to find this with you. But I don't want to run from it either." His voice was steady, but I could hear the vulnerability beneath it. I looked at him, the fading light softening his features, and I felt the truth of his words resonate inside me. I told him that sometimes the most unexpected paths are the ones that matter most. We walked back in silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because words weren't needed. The closeness between us spoke louder than anything we could have uttered. When we reached my house, he lingered at the porch, the air thick with unspoken emotion. Finally, he reached out and held my hand, not with urgency, but with quiet assurance. "Whatever this is," he said, "I want to see where it goes." I squeezed his hand gently, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine, and whispered, "So do I." That night, after he left, I sat in my living room with the lamp casting its golden glow across the photographs still resting in the box. I realized those old letters and pictures had brought him to me, but what mattered now wasn't the past, they had simply opened the door for something new. As I reflected, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had a way of surprising me when I least expected it. I had answered my door thinking I was offering help, and instead, I had discovered companionship, honesty, and a connection that reminded me how alive I still was. And so, this story isn't about what was lost or what was remembered. It's about what was found. About two people who stumbled into each other's lives, carrying their own quiet burdens, and discovered that by sharing them, they became lighter. When I think about him now, I don't just think of my friend's brother. I think of someone who reminded me that it's never too late to begin again. That sometimes, the most meaningful chapters of our lives are the ones that come when we least expect them.